Hi, Connecting Point. I want to jump into a table talk right away this week, and we're going to start with this question: how do you get to know someone? I've been reading a book lately by Eugene Peterson called Working the Angles, and in this book, he brings out this point that when we're reading the Bible, we do a great disservice to it when we see it as something other than essentially a storybook. A lot of people treat the Bible as lots of different things. Maybe it's like a answer book or a set of doctrines to be uncovered or something like that. I've heard it described as basic instructions before leaving Earth, Bible. And it kind of makes me cringe a little bit to hear people reducing the Bible like that, because where it begins with is a hero and God. In the beginning, God. And then he does something, and then problems start. And the book ends with that hero returning to the thing that he made and rescuing it. It's a beautiful, wonderful story. And that is what the Bible is essentially a story. Now, it does have different types of literature that are inside of it, but that's the fundamental purpose, is to tell us the story of God. You might even argue that the fundamental purpose of all language actually is storytelling. You think about when you get to know somebody. This is why I wanted you to start with getting to know someone. How do you get to know them? It's not by saying, tell me all of the things that you think. Tell me the hardest math question you can do. Tell me your job, right? All of that is part of who they are. But if you're saying, hey, tell me about yourself, you expect to be told a story, right? Some set of stories, a life story, maybe who knows what, right? But everyone kind of comes at it, and it's, who we are is fundamentally a storytelling kind of a behavior. It's a strange thing to think about, that we have this book, this Bible. It is written, and that written word, I wouldn't expect to get to know you and then have you write me a letter. If I say, hey, tell me about yourself, I wouldn't expect you to go away, write it all down and curate it, and figure out what you want to tell me, and then present me with this polished piece of writing. It's a much more organic thing. It's much more of an, that's how a relationship is formed, is kind of in this oral way. And you think about where the Bible comes from. It's not written down at first, right? The first time we see the Bible being written down is when Moses is recording what's been going on through the Exodus stories. We don't have any record of Abraham writing things, Joseph, Jacob, right? This is all oral tradition, essentially, that gets handed down, and Moses ends up becoming the chronicler of this, family history, that they have this very well-developed oral tradition. And most of the stories that you read in the Old Testament happen to be oral tradition first and written later. And it's this much more organic, personal way of telling us the story, of God telling us his story. It's a spoken tale. It's not a written, curated thing. Even think about Jesus. The one thing that he writes is he scribbles in sand. In the whole Gospels, that's the one time that he writes anything down. Otherwise, he's telling stories. He's talking to people, and the disciples are recalling stories later. And that's what we end up getting as our 4 Gospels that are written to us. When we make the Bible all about the written text, we also undermine it in some ways. And we need to remember that the Bible isn't just a written book. It's also God's live word to us. It's God telling us his story. And it's kind of here that I want to start, because I want to tell you about a particular weird story this week that really captured the imagination of a 10-year-old boy who I knew very well, because he was me. I was sitting in church one Sunday and listening to a sermon by someone, and being bored because I'm 10, and it's going over my head and this whole thing. So I start flipping through my Bible, and I come across Judges chapter 3. And I see, this is a short, bite-sized little story. Let's read it. And it's about this guy named Ehud. And it freaks out this 10-year-old boy, because I've been in Sunday school a lot. I've spent a lot of time going through the David and Goliath and, Samson and Delilah and all the other stories that are really traditional kids' Sunday school lesson stories. Never once did I get an Ehud story. And I couldn't figure out why, because it is epic. And also then I could figure out why, because it's so violent and kind of disturbing. But to a 10-year-old boy, it was very exciting. I remember almost not being able to contain my enthusiasm about it. Dad, did you know what's in the Bible? Right? Like this kind of excitement, and it's a weird story. And so, as a grown man now, I'm a little embarrassed kind of thinking about my enthusiasm for this disgusting, grim story that we find and what we're going to talk about today. But something of what I was recognizing was just how magnificent this little nugget of narrative is that we have in Judges. It's this really well-developed, crafted story that would be a wonderful, oral story told in the old traditions. But also as a written story, it's got a lot to go with. Peterson, one of his points in his book, he points out that it's a shame that adults dismiss storytelling as a childish thing. We make stories this thing that you do to your kids. You do it with your kids. But then you grow up and you get mature, and we don't need stories anymore. Now we need to be taught propositions and things to understand and instructions and how to make money and how to win friends and influence people or whatever. We spend too much of our time using words for function, forgetting that the function of words is essentially story and getting to know yourself and someone else's story. So let's read through our text, Judges chapter 3, and we're going to pick up in verse 12 and go to 31. The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel, because they had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. After Eglon convinced the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join forces with him, he attacked and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. And then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he raised up Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed Benjaminite, as a deliverer for them. The Israelites sent him to Eglon, king of Moab, with tribute money. Ehud made himself a double-edged sword, 18 inches long. He strapped it to his right thigh under his clothes and brought the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried it. At the carved images near Gilgal, he returned, and he said, King Eglon, I have a secret message for you. The king called for silence, and all his attendants left him. And then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in his room upstairs where it was cool. Ehud said, I have a word from God for you. And the king stood up from his throne. Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into Eglon's belly. Even the handle went in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closed in over it, so that Ehud did not withdraw the sword from his belly. And Eglon's insides came out. Ehud escaped by way of the porch, closing and locking the doors of the upstairs room behind him. Ehud was gone when Eglon's servants came in. They looked and found the doors of the upstairs room locked and thought he was relieving himself in the cool room. The servants waited until they became worried and saw that he had still not opened the doors of the upstairs room. So they took the key and they opened their doors. And there was their lord, lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while the servants waited. He crossed over the Jordan near the carved images and reached Serah. After he arrived, he sounded the ram's horn throughout the hill country of Ephraim. The Israelites came down with him from the hill country, and he became their leader. He told them, Follow me, because the Lord has handed over your enemies, the Moabites, to you. And so they followed him, captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all strong and able-bodied men. Not one of them escaped. Moab became subject to Israel that day, and the land was peaceful for 80 years. After Ehud, Shamgar, son of Anath, became judge. He delivered Israel by striking down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Okay, so I'm going to send you back to another table talk just quickly, and the question is, does this particular weird story remind you of any other biblical stories? So I don't know what stories you came up with particularly from your discussion time. Ehud's story, like many of the other Old Testament stories that you'll come across in the Judges or in 1 Samuel or maybe David and Goliath, it has a little bit of that underdog flavor to it. Where Ehud fits into our bigger narrative of the book of Judges is right after Othniel. And you'll recall from last week, Doug talked about how Othniel acts as something like the model judge. Everything is good as far as what Othniel does, as far as his connections with people, Caleb particularly, from the tribe that he's part of, Judah, and then the way that he behaves, where God gives him the power and God gives him the victory, and Othniel credits God with all this stuff. Ehud is an interesting guy because he's not a model judge the same way as Othniel is. There's some different kinds of things about him, and hopefully we'll unpack some of what's going on with him. So let's get into some of these details about Ehud. Just as a bit of the backdrop, we have Eglon as this enemy king. He's the other main character in our story, the antagonist, as it were. And he's the king of Moab. And so you may recall Moab is one of the nations through which Israel has to travel as they're coming towards the Promised Land. And they're actually situated east of the Jordan River, kind of where modern-day Transjordan is, the Kingdom of Jordan. Moab's kind of there. And then the other two groups that they are in charge of, that Eglon has wrangled to be on his side, are the Amalekites and the Ammonites. And all of these guys are located east of the Jordan River, where the Israelites are. They're west of the Jordan River. Both the Moabites and the Ammonites trace their lineage back to Lot, Abraham's nephew. And the Amalekites trace their lineage back to Esau, Jacob's brother, twin brother. And so they have this particular relationship, I guess harried, fragile, fraught relationship with the people of Israel, in that they are related, they know who each other are, and they don't like each other very much. And so Israel actually is harassed by all of these groups as they do the Exodus story. All three of them end up as particular foes of the Israelites. And they invade over the west, to the west into Israel, and they take over pieces of the land, and they actually set up a camp in the City of Palms, it's called in your text, which is actually Jericho in all likelihood. They likely didn't set up city walls there, but it's a very good defensible position, and I mean, even conceivably after Joshua destroys it, it's still situated in a good spot, and it still controls a good valley and fertile land and all that kind of stuff. Likely they're set up in Jericho as kind of a mobile base, or as a foothold base in the area of Israel. And they're oppressing the Israelites, and they do so for 18 years, you'll notice. And they're exacting tribute from the Israelites. 18 years, that's longer than Othniel's time. In the Othniel story, it only takes the Israelites 8 years to cry out against the oppression of their oppressors. And in our story now, Ehud, it takes them 18 years of living in this broken way. They've done evil in the sight of the Lord. It doesn't say specifically what that evil is, but from some kind of context clues, we can assume that it's idolatry. That seems to be the snare that they keep on running into. And Ehud's actually going to particularly interact with some carved images, you'll notice, through our story today, twice in our story. Ehud himself is an interesting character. He's described as left-handed, and the phrase that's used to describe a left-handed person actually talks about them being deformed or disabled in their right hand. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that was the case, that Ehud was actually physically handicapped, though it might have been. And the Benjaminites seem to have had this particular trait running throughout their people group quite a bit. Later on in Judges, we're going to actually hear the Benjaminites described as many of them being left-handed, and it causing some particular problems for their enemies, because when they are engaged in combat, it's a different thing. I actually heard a sports guy describe how a left-handed basketball player is good for an extra 5 points per game, just because the opposing team will forget that he's left-handed, because they're so used to playing against right-handed guys that they'll just guard him slightly wrong, and then he'll get his left-handed shots up easier. Imagine putting that into a life and death situation. Now you've got a whole kind of a different kettle of fish. But it's especially interesting, though, that Ehud is left-handed, because Benjamin, as a name, means son of the right hand. So he's got this funny, ironic kind of personality built around that he's doing everything a little backwards. Certainly the author intends us to see some irony and humor even in this. And that's the overall tenor and tone of this story, is that the author wants us to see it as humorous. We'll come back to that idea in a minute. It isn't stated specifically that Ehud's left-handedness is what allows him to sneak his weapon in to the king's audience, but I have read a suggestion in one of the commentaries that in the frisking and pat down kind of a thing, that they wouldn't have actually looked at his right thigh because who hides a knife there or a sword there? So I don't know. Maybe the king's security was just super lazy, or they were super arrogant, or Ehud was particularly amenable to the Moabite rule and seemed like he was on their side or something. We don't get a ton of details about this, but he deliberately has this murder weapon that he sneaked into to the presence of the king. Ehud making that murder weapon in verse 16 is a vague phrase in Hebrew, made for himself. This murder weapon, it's not really himself. That's a translator clarification. It's made for him a sword. So is that he made it for Ehud to use, or is it he made it for Eglon to insert it into this man? Again, the author's intending us to see some double meaning and some kind of humor in the way that we're wording this thing. Eglon, as a name, also is kind of a funny and ironic name, as the word Eglon means calf in Hebrew, and it also has connotations for circular or round. And so Eglon being a fat man, he's like a calf fattened for the slaughter, or he's like it would almost be like calling him King Butterball, right? In our day and age, where that word is, turkey and that kind of a thing. Okay, it's kind of weird to say that, but it of course becomes a key feature in that climax moment of the story where Ehud inserts the regicidal weapon into King Butterball and takes him down as the story proceeds to our climax. So our Benjaminite boy Ehud gets this job of taking the Israelites' tribute payment as a present to King Eglon. And then you notice that he has to dismiss his helpers, the people that he comes with to deliver the tribute. So presumably this is a lot of whatever, be it just money or be it in kind as well, oil or animals or something like that. And Ehud brings along this whole crew. They deliver the tribute. Like, this is enough to be an onerous task on anybody, and especially if this is like a poor people trying to get settled in the land, and then they're getting, all this goods and stuff ripped from them. So, but Ehud delivers the thing successfully, possibly ingratiating himself to the king and the guards and the whole crew. But then, you notice what happens then. He dismisses everybody. He's going back, and at Gilgal, where the Lord's presence was with Joshua and where they had met like that, what does he see now? Carved images. And so whether these are Moabite images that they've set up, or whether these are Israelite images where they are failing to do God's work, Ehud is triggered in some way by coming across the carved images, and so he turns back at this point. Now, we don't know for sure what's going on. If he had lost his nerve and he was originally going to commit this act of murder, like when he was delivering the tribute, and then lost his nerve and went and then got fired back up by seeing the evidence of idolatry at the place where God had met with the Israelites, or if it's more like it was a way to, like, a part of the subterfuge that he's doing. We don't know exactly, but we see that this moment is a trigger moment for Ehud, and he turns back, and so the idolatry triggers the act of God's vengeance, as it were. Now, nowhere in our text does it say that God came upon Ehud to do this, right? This seems to be something that Ehud just does of his own accord, and I want to come back to that thought in a minute as well. Othniel's story is really bare bones in the detail that's included. It's mostly names and dates and just kind of gives you the sketch. But Ehud's story bursts into this technicolor, grisly scene as he re-enters the king's chambers. And that's the part of the story that really kind of made it seem epic to me as a 10-year-old kid. The whole sequence is rendered probably more politely than the original Hebrew in your English translation. It's gross, and it's designed to be gross, and it's designed for this kind of schadenfreude, right? Like laughing at the misfortune of the Moabite king. It's as gross and weird and memorable as you think it's going to be in the Hebrew. The sequence where the insides come out is actually suggestive of more like the contents of his intestines are spilled upon the floor. And later on you find the king's servants are thinking that the king is relieving himself in his inner chamber, so anyhow, that I had to ask questions about all that when I was a kid, and try to figure out what is an inner chamber, like what's the difference between an outer chamber and inner chamber. Oh, okay, I guess that's the difference. And it's gross and it's weird, and the whole thing is supposed to kind of make you laugh. So the question is, like, why would we include this story where we're supposed to, kind of be amused by this gross thing? And I guess part of the way to think of it is to think about the down place that the Israelites are, and think about the people who are reading this story or who are telling this story to each other. Likely, if we're still in the time of the Judges, they're still under oppression from somebody. And this is a story of hope and, look at what God does to our enemies, kind of a thing. And it's an important principle in some ways, but it's also, I think that it's as patriotic and particularistic as all of that. So it kind of is it's a story that we can't embrace wholeheartedly, the way that they might have back then. Nonetheless, the idea that the commentators want you to try to see is that you're supposed to see some degree of humors as it all kind of escalates and becomes this comedy of errors, right? The level of surprise that the servants have when they finally unlock the king's room and come across him is just not rendered in English. It's kind of like a wholly expletive moment kind of a thing, right? Is what you're expecting to have happening. But Ehud then makes his escape while the king is bleeding out on the floor of his inner chamber, and he summons the tribes of Israel to join him to take down the Moabites. Now, I don't know if this is just because Eglon is a particularly charismatic leader who's holding this Moabite, Ammonite, Amalekite alliance together, and Ehud knows it's all going to break, or what's going on, or who knows exactly why this is. Nonetheless, they show up, and it's especially interesting that he's going up to the hill country. That's Ephraim, the hill country, not Benjamin. So he goes and he summons the Ephraimites to come and join him, the Benjamite, in taking down the Moabites. And they show up. And boy, do they ever show up. They go and they capture the ford between the west bank of the Jordan River and the east bank of the Jordan River, and the Moabites, in their attempt to withdraw, get just destroyed by the Israelites, and they take them down, and they end up with an 80-year peace, which is double the peace that you see for Othniel, and double the peace that you see after Deborah, which we're going to find out about in the coming weeks. So it's quite this interesting thing, this massive, epic victory that is like doubly strong compared to the other judges' victories in some sense. We are, however, left with this question of what to do with Ehud being like a terrorist and a criminal and a regicide, right? Is this a stamp of approval on lying and murder? I don't know. We need to remember that mindset of this is an oppressed people amongst an oppressing group of people who are trying to figure out how to deal with them when they're a minority. And so how do you have the right approach against these people? It's also the prophetic history that we're talking about. So Ehud being spurred to action by righteous anger at seeing Israel's idolatry and seeing Moab's idolatry as well is something that we should kind of keep in mind. We can't possibly endorse this as the type of behavior that we do today, and that's not like you see that with Christ, that there's this remixing of kind of the themes of the Old Testament and emphasis on kind of the more loving aspects of things and noting God's grace, and rather than having individuals be called out to act as God's justice and act as God's vengeance. Nonetheless, at this time, this is what was supposed to be happening, right? This is the context of holy war against a people group who is unrepentant in their sin. There is justice for that, and there is judgment for that, and Ehud is within that context, right? We can also note a couple of things that make Ehud not look the model judge like Othniel was. Nowhere in our story, like I mentioned earlier, do we see the Lord's Spirit empowering him specifically, though Ehud does give the Lord credit, and the Lord did raise him up. So we have this kind of mixed message about who Ehud is. Ehud clearly believes in the Lord, and he believes that the Lord is the one who is giving the Israelites their victory over the Moabites, and that seems to be borne out by that 80 years of peace. But Ehud also does seem to have his cowardice overcome, or his particular anger overcome, or overpowers his trepidation because of the idolatry. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. It all leaves a bit of a mixed legacy, right? Like, we clearly see a murderer. We also clearly see God using it for vengeance and justice. And so I want to give you a table talk to think about that. Do you see Ehud as a good guy or a bad guy? So our text ends this week in verse 31 with a one-verse judge, Shamgar. And he's interesting. He actually fits in with Ehud quite well. Shamgar also uses some pretty extreme violence in his story, killing 600 people. And his name gives us some interesting context about who he is as well. Shamgar isn't a Hebrew name. And Anath, which is, he's noted as Shamgar, son of Anath. Anath is likely a Canaanite goddess. So we can kind of make some guesses about what that exactly means. But Shamgar is not necessarily a ethnic Hebrew. Nonetheless, he's used by God to bring about a victory over the Philistines. He also begins this tradition, shall we call it, in Judges, wherein a strange implement is used as God's weapon of vengeance over against this set of peoples who put their strength in swords and chariots. So Ehud he's a left-handed guy who does this weird thing backwards and commits an assassination. Shamgar ends up using a farming implement, an ox goad, which is like a long stick with a pointy end, kind of like a spear, but it's not as deliberately weaponized as a spear. It's for prodding oxes. He's a cowherd, basically, is Shamgar. And he does unspeakable violence with this ox goad and is kind of given some degree of praise about that whole thing. We're going to see this continued theme pop up in Judges, that God doesn't need chariots or swords or other trappings of worldly power to achieve his ends. God will just as quickly use an assassin or a cowherd or a prophet or a woman to act as a judge. And we're going to learn about that next week, and that's going to be very interesting. But we're going to see this thing happen repeatedly in Judges, that God uses an imperfect vessel many times. Not always just your ideal guy like Othniel, who has all the right connections and looks the part of the leader. God's goodwill is still done through these imperfect vessels. And that's kind of where I want to leave you off this week. Here's our final table talk question. Have you ever felt disqualified from doing God's work? And then I want you to take some time to pray with one another that God's mercy and his sovereignty will be apparent to you, and that you'll have confidence that his goodwill is going to work out even through your imperfect vessel nature. All right, have a good week.